Got 4 minutes until.
Hi, Monica.
More protection.
Haven't seen you forever in person.
More joy. Each defense.
She doesn't have hers on, maybe.
The sun
She's red.
brand used most by dermatologists and their families.
I know.
Neutrogena for people with skin.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the group asked some reasonable questions.
Yeah, Joan had a very good question. I hadn't noticed the variance.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Everybody online hear me? Thumbs up. There we go. Let's just hope we can keep our internet active today. So welcome to the May 17th, 2021 meeting of the Rotary Club of Ames. Please stand for our Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States
States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God.
indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And while we're standing, let's remain standing. If you've seen in your email, Karen sent out that our former club member, former club president Don Wandling passed away, living in Naples, Florida. So we'll keep his family certainly in our thoughts and prayers. Is there anyone else that we need to be aware here or anyone online? Well, let's take a moment for Don's family and anyone else who might need a moment extra thought and prayer this morning. Thank you. Here, locally, I do not think we have any visitors or guests that I'm aware of. Regardless of that, we have John Christie here from our music committee, who will locally lead us in our welcome song. Everyone, please join in. You can have your hand held if you want to dance around a bit here.
Oh, so you want me to dance now that I've come out of the studio? Yes, right. To our guests and visitors, here in person and obviously virtually, welcome to you from Ames Rotary, Naveda, London, or Gay Paris, from far off lands or the USA. We're glad that you are here today. Come back again, whenever you're near. Join us and then we'll make it clear. Around the world you will always be. Welcome at Rotary.
A few announcements. First of all, how do we survive every Monday without prime rib? That's a question. So thank you to the Gateway for supplying us some good food today. As you can see, we have an opportunity coming up for some local service out at the Ada Hayden Overlook. We have Sophie Johnson, who is coordinating this. If you're going to be there and you know for sure, it'd be great if you could maybe RSVP to her and let her know. But this is going to be Saturday, the 22nd, 9 to noon at the Rotary Overlook. And again, if you're willing to be a part of planning and what's going to happen there, there's going to be a pre-meeting on the 19th at 8:30 a.m. there as well. And then thank you to Deb Schildroth for getting us some information here. There's an upcoming public forum. So be aware that there's a mental health concern. It's going to be held 6:30 to 8:30 on Thursday, May 20th at the Ames City Auditorium. There's also a remote live stream option if you go to the City of Ames organization website and look for Channel 12. We also have an announcement for our upcoming social at Ryman Gardens. I think it's still intact after the senior and junior prom from Ames High. They actually had a lot of people and really had a great time. at the Ryman Gardens. And now we're going to be celebrating there together on Monday, June 7th. We'll have our meeting there. Feel free to bring a guest and then explore the gardens at your leisure from 11 to 2. We'll have some box lunches available as well. So we'll pray for a sunny, beautiful day for June 7th. And then just a reminder about Ryla, current sophomore or junior that you're aware of in our area, please encourage them to apply at iowaryla.org. We need some students, but we also need Rotary volunteers. So impacting youth and leadership is something that you hold in a high regard, then we certainly would appreciate you reaching out to the coordinators. That's July 18th to 23rd at Coe College in Cedar Rapids. And I think that's all we have for announcements today. So with that, we'll get on to our program, and I'm going to have Tammy Colbeck come up and introduce our speaker today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I won't touch anything. I don't think I MediaCom, but since it happened during my announcement last time, I'll try to stay away. So it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Jacob Meyer, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Kinesiology and director of the Wellbeing and Exercise Laboratory at Iowa State. He hails from Madison, Wisconsin, and his academic path began at St. Olaf College before graduate school and postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Wisconsin in kinesiology and the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health, before arriving here in Ames at Iowa State in 2017. His research focuses on the associations between mental health and physical activity, exercise, sedentary behavior, using both epidemiological and psychobiological approaches. I practiced with him on those before I got up here. His current work examines how exercise can be used in the treatment of depression and in behavioral and psychological effects of the pandemic. He's also starting to explore some research on the effects of the pandemic, especially in pregnant women. So I'm not sure if he'll touch on that, but he's continuing to do even more research on the effects of the pandemic. Let's welcome Dr. Jacob Meyer.
Awesome. Thank you, Tammy, for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm excited to get to share with you guys a little bit about the research that I do, and also a little bit more about sort of the pandemic's effects in general. I think there's some useful stuff for us all to think about as we go forward with life, which one day might be post-pandemic. So hopefully we'll have had is my goal. So there we go. So I'm going to give you sort of an overall overview of what I think about and what the research in my lab looks at, to give you kind of a glimpse into the workings that we do. No, Mike?
Mike, your mic's not on, so it's on, you see something close. Yeah,
Am I close to enough now? All right. Hello? Does that work? All right. Sounds good. To me, I sound the same both ways. So, so here's just one of my favorite quotes from Plato: "Lack of activity destroys the good condition of every human being, while movement and methodical physical exercise save it and preserve it." And so there's always been a really clear connection between the way that people move and how they think and how they feel from a very long time ago. However, really figuring out how we use that connection has eluded us individually and sort of societally for a long time. So some of the work that I do tries to figure out exactly how exercise and the brain interact with each other. So through undergrad at St. Olaf College, like Tammy had said, I struggled with depression at various times during my 4 years there. Not St. Olaf's fault or anything. That's just the way that, in particular for in young adulthood, for many people, And one of the things that I realized is that I played soccer while I was there, and during the periods when my mental health was in its best spot was when I was exercising regularly. And when I wasn't exercising, that's when I started to sort of move toward the cliff. And for me, as I sort of went through those sort of ups and downs of life, I started to realize that like there's something going on here, that there's something about activity and behavior and the stuff important for the way that we feel. And so I started to try to figure that out a little bit. In addition, I had a teammate on the soccer team who suffered from bipolar disorder, and he would have really high highs and really low lows. And after practice, every day, no matter what, he was in the most consistent and best state of mind that I would see him in over the course of the whole time that we were together. And it was interesting to me because it was like, well, what's happening in this exercise period that's changing the way that he's acting and behaving afterwards, or sort of helping normalize or get him into a different state of mind. And so this sort of brain behavior thing kept cropping up. So I wanted to figure out how this happened, and not only how does this happen, but how do we use these benefits for everybody, make this happen a little bit more often, and for a few more people. So I got my undergrad in kinesiology or neuroscience, and then I moved to the University of Wisconsin, Madison, for my master's and PhD, which were in exercise psychology. So really trying to figure out how behavior and mental health are related. I stayed there for a postdoc as well in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health, which was great because coming from a kines background, everybody thinks about exercise all the time. The Department of Family Medicine and physicians, they don't think about exercise all that often. So it was really useful for me to sort of see the perspective of others who have a big say in what people's behaviors look like. You know, physicians have a lot to do there, and the way that exercise was conceived of was very different. We knew that if people exercise, that'd be great, but it doesn't happen all that often. And a physician telling someone to exercise is unlikely to really change their behavior very much. So that isn't a routine part of practice or a routine part of training. There's no kinesiology courses in medical school. So I then moved here after my family medicine to try to figure out if we can work specifically towards understanding exercise and mental health, and then how do we integrate that into healthcare. So big picture, my research looks at a couple of things: exercise or physical activity or movement or sedentary behavior, basically all the stuff that we do with our body, and then how that's associated with mental health, in particular depression, which is the area of personal interest, but also most of my research interest. And then I've also branched out with pain and substance use disorders in some other areas. And while we know that there's a relationship between those top two things, that something that becomes really important to understand that relationship is how does it work? So when somebody exercises, what's happening that changes the way that they think or how they feel? And if we understand that, then we can maybe figure out what the right exercises are or the right ways to change behavior that's going to have the biggest effect on mental health. So this is sort of the framework work off of. We've got a bunch of studies that are going on right now. The drink study, this is a dehydration, rehydration study funded by an industry partner, where we're trying to figure out when people get dehydrated and they rehydrate with different beverages like Gatorade or other commercial beverages, how does their cognitive function improve or come back? We're doing this to try to figure out, in particular, how exercise, what you should be consuming after exercise. A software company that we're working with that's in inpatient substance use treatment facilities. So when people go into a residential treatment facility for, 5 weeks or 7 weeks to help with substance use disorder, putting physical activity questions into the things that they track across those 5 weeks to figure out if how people's behavior changes across those 5 weeks can help predict success. So are those people who are more active during be less likely to readmit? Readmission rates are super high for things like residential treatment facilities. We're trying to figure out what are the best ways that we can predict that and then prevent it from happening. Active CBT, which is one of my favorite projects. Here we're trying to figure out how exercise right before a psychotherapy session changes the way that those psychotherapy sessions happen, with the idea being that if we can prime someone to respond right before, is this going to change the overall effectiveness of therapy for things like depression or anxiety or PTSD? That's a really fun study. I'm not going to talk that much about it though, but I really like it. And then the final stuff and the stuff that I'm going to talk about today, because I think it's probably the most relevant to everybody, is our COVID research. So looking at how behavior has changed in response to COVID. And so sort of like each of these are up here in different spots based upon which pieces of the puzzle they. So the COVID-19 opportunity, and I use the word opportunity because I didn't really have a great other word to come up with. We've all been presented with COVID since last winter, really, and trying to figure out how this was going to change behavior and what was going to happen and how we were going to adjust. And one of the things that I started doing really early on with a few other colleagues was realizing that not only have to work from home and do other things that are different, but we're going to have to have big parts of our society that change. You know, we're all in here. There's some people with masks on. We have to have masks on when we're not eating or where we are. That's going to last for a while. And we knew that there were going to be a lot of things that continue to change. And so we wanted to track people's behavior and figure out how is behavior changing in response to this? And then also, how's that related to people's mental health? Because we know there's that connection between behavior and mental health. And a lot of other things shut down at the beginning. We were trying to figure out how does that affect the way that people feel. You've likely seen lots of data about increases in depression and anxiety in response to the pandemic. And the question is that driven by the changes in behavior that we had to go through, or are there other things going on? So that's what we wanted to try to figure out. So some of you guys might actually be in this study. If you are in this study, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you a million times. We recruited people who were alums of Iowa State. How many of you guys are alums of Iowa State? For those of you online, that's about half the people. How about those who work at Iowa State in some fashion? Still a few. Yeah. Okay. So many people here are affiliated with Iowa State in some way. So we recruited people through the Iowa State listservs, through anyone who was a current faculty at Iowa State. And then the ISU Foundation, being the wonderful people that they are, allowed us to send an email to every ISU alum who they had an email on file for, to try to recruit for this study so that we could start to track behavior on a large section of the population. And so what we did was we sent out these emails to everybody and asked them to sign up to be in this study where we could see how behavior is changing across time. And so we first started off with just a cross-sectional study looking at the first week of April last year. How has your behavior changed since the pandemic? How's your mental health right now? And looking at if we can put those things together or if they're just unrelated. And then we started following across time, having people fill out every week how they were feeling, how their behavior had changed. And since then, we've been filling out every month how people's behavior has changed, which will finally end in June. We've been slowly extending this because it's like, wow, COVID's still here. It hasn't gone away. I guess we have to keep going. But in June, we're done. No matter what, we're done. It's over. I'll share some of the data that we've gotten from this, which has just been really fascinating to try to figure out how things have changed and how people are feeling in response to that. So the primary questions that we were interested in, being the Wellbeing and Exercise Lab, how does physical activity, sitting time, and screen time in response to the pandemic? How's our mental health? And is that different based upon how our sitting, screen time, and physical activity have changed? Are the people whose physical activity changed the most those who have the worst mental health? And then how do changes across time, changes in people's behavior across time, as things started opening up across last summer, how was that related to the way that people's mental health changed across time? Did those go hand in hand, distinct from each other? So, bunch of numbers, take home here. We had about 3,000 people who filled out the first round of the survey, which is a ton and super useful because those people were distributed across lots of different age groups, both sexes, genders, distributed across BMI categories. We got a really nice snapshot of a lot of different people. And so we were able to look at a number of relationships from that. So I'll highlight What we see here is, see if I can move you guys out of the way. Oh, there's only, that's okay. Super. Thank you, Karen. I appreciate it. What we see here is we split people based upon whether or not before the pandemic, they were meeting the US physical activity guidelines. So the US physical activity guidelines are getting 150 minutes of moderate or vigorous physical activity each week. So that's 2.5 hours of exercise, essentially across the course of the week. And so the little runner people on the left were those who were meeting those guidelines. And then the people who were standing were the people who weren't meeting those guidelines. And then we looked at how behavior changed pandemic. And you'll notice that on the left, we see no matter how people were, what mitigation measures they were practicing, so self-isolation or stay-at-home order or social distancing, we saw large decreases in exercise behavior in those people who used to be active. And on the right, not a whole lot changed in those people who didn't used to be active. Well, that sort of makes sense. If you weren't exercising before, you can't really like get less exercisey because room to go there. But for those people who were exercising, there was a big change, about 30%. And then if we look at the things that increased, sitting time and screen time, across the board, we saw about 30% increases in both sitting time and screen time. This is per day. So we ended up sitting 30% more, using screens about 30% more. Now, I probably don't have to tell you that because there's a bunch of people up here on my screen who are clearly using screens right now, and we're all looking at something. But that's the way that things changed. And in particular, we know that both sitting time and screen time are associated with worse mental health. So now we have to figure out all these things that we have to do in response to the pandemic. How important is that for how we're feeling? And if we know that, can we make modifications to help improve our mental health? So another slide, lots of numbers. The ones that matter, I will show you. So we broke people out into 4 different groups. You know how I talked about having people, whether or not active at the beginning. We also then had people tell us if they were active now, so during the pandemic. And we could say, okay, people who used to be active and were still active, that means they maintained their activity. That's the top group. People who didn't used to be active and then became active, that's this next group. Not a whole lot of those people, as you might have guessed. People who decreased, those who were active and then became inactive, or those people who stayed low, maintained low, were not active at either time point. Across each of these 4 groups, we did that for physical activity. We also did it for sitting time, as to whether or not people got above 8 hours a day of sitting time, and screen time, as to whether or not people got above 8 hours a day of screen time. And what you'll see is that in the group where they decreased their physical activity, or the group whose screen time increased, we see higher depression, higher loneliness, higher stress, and worse positive mental health. It's another way of sort of thinking about this, but trying to put a better spin on it. What we saw was that, yes, we did see changes in behavior, and those changes in behavior were related to mental health as we expected. So the question becomes, well, what do we do about that, and how can we help with that? And if we do nothing, what happens over time? So as you guys probably remember, last April and May, lots of things were happening. The world was changing very quickly, and there were changes in guidelines. We could now meet in groups of at least 10, or groups of at least couldn't do certain things at different time points. And this sample included people from every single state in the United States. Well, what was happening in Iowa was different from what was happening in Arizona, was different from what was happening all over. And so we had to think about that by trying to look across time, how do changes in people's behavior relate to changes in their mental health? And so what we see here, unfortunately, Karen, I'm gonna move them again. Okay. There we go. Oh, well, whatever, it'll do. The important one is in the top left, which is why I had to move it out of the way. So what we see, man, this is awesome. So what we see here is we're looking at across time. So I told you guys that we had people fill this out every week for 8 weeks across all of May and across all of April and across all of May last year. As we were starting to sort of reopen the country, we see that during those time periods, people's mental health top, depression in general is going down across the 8 weeks. Anxiety going down across the 8 weeks. The bottom is the positive mental health, so that's going up across the 8 weeks. So that's good. But then we split it out by sitting time, screen time, and physical activity to see if those people whose sitting time stayed high, was that associated with the way that their depression got better. And it turned out that for sitting time in particular, those people whose sitting time stayed high and didn't come back down had worse depression to begin with, but then at the end, that difference was bigger. So there was sort of a lasting effect of this high sitting time associated with the pandemic that wasn't present for the screen time or the MVPA minutes that we were looking at. What this sort of tells us is that the sort of change in sitting due to the pandemic might have lasting effects, in particular on depression, that manifest themselves over time, which is important. The longitudinal data also allowed us to take a look at for who the pandemic affected the most. What you see here on the first three multicolored graphs are breaking it out by age group. The red group are the young adults, so those are the college students, 18 to 24. You'll notice that they were those most affected. They had the worst mental health at the start of the pandemic, but it did start to come back over time. So although this affected young adults most, everyone improved as we kept going. It sort of shows resiliency in general for both Americans, but also in particular young adults as we went through this. All right. I want to switch gears a little bit and think about pregnancy during the pandemic. So this is another, I have a graduate student who's particularly interested in pregnancy. And so we started trying to look at how the pandemic was affecting everybody, but in particular women who either were pregnant or were thinking about becoming pregnant. Lots of changes happened in the healthcare area where people couldn't go to visits. You couldn't have your partner come to visits. Maybe you weren't going to be able to have your partner at the birth. Lots of potentially stressful things occurring. And in general, pregnancy is a high stress period. So we know that this is a high stress period. Is there something that that we can do in particular when people in high stress situations are stressed extra by a pandemic, say? So we started to look at physical activity during the pandemic for pregnant women. In particular, we want to look at, we know exercise is helpful for reducing depression and anxiety. And we know that exercise is helpful for reducing both of those things in pregnant women. But how important is it when we've got all this other stuff happening, like the pandemic, like changes in work, changes in our home lives? And so this is stuff that we're just really pulling apart right now. But what you'll see up here is you see on the left, non-pregnant women, and on the right, the pregnant women. And what we're seeing on the y-axis or going up is the level of depression. And it's split. The blue is those who don't meet the US physical activity guidelines, that 150 minutes thing. And the yellow is those who do. And it turns out that during the pandemic, those who didn't or did meet the US physical activity guidelines didn't matter a whole lot for depression in the non-pregnant women. But in the, see this nice decrease in that yellow group, that yellow bar, where they're better off in terms of their depression than the non-active counterparts. And if we sort of compare these two groups in those who are not pregnant and those who are pregnant, exercise is 5.79 times more helpful for depression for pregnant women than for non-pregnant women. And if we look at anxiety, we see a, if I can shift you guys around again, and I can, the question is, where do we go? Here, there we go. All right. And so for anxiety, exercise is 4.78 times more helpful for anxiety in pregnant women than in non-pregnant women. What this is basically showing us is that the benefits of exercise are enhanced or magnified for pregnant women, in particular during this COVID period. Helps us sort of think about, as people get pushed closer to the edge of their abilities, behaviors that we know are really important, like exercise or maintaining or limiting screen time or sitting time, could be even more important than normal, because it's something that people can do and have control over, even if they don't have control over many of the other things that are going on. So what do we know? Well, lots of things changed. We all know that. In particular, those people who were active their activity, but everybody had big increases in screen time and sitting time. Seems like maintaining activity or figuring out how to get people into that active group would be really important. Since many people had shifted to working from home, about 40% of the people in our sample had been in a working from home environment. There was lots of increased screen time that had to happen. Engaging in work while you're at home, you've got to do more screen time. But that doesn't mean that all sort of negotiable screen time when we're looking at our phones or doing other things needs to sort of maintain or increase. We know that happened for many people during the pandemic, and thinking about what is screen time that's mandatory and then what's non-mandatory screen time, how do we go about managing that would be really helpful for our mental health. The pregnancy results, which I think are really interesting to think about. Pregnancy, a period of high stress to begin with. Exercise seems to be even more important during a period of time because of the pandemic being around for things like depression and anxiety. It really makes it clear how important it is to support vulnerable groups, be they pregnant women, be they different racial or ethnic groups during a time period like this when there's increased stress on our healthcare and societal systems. So what do we do next? Well, this is data, and we'll continue to produce wonderful data, but also data that can be useful for people who are making decisions as to how do we promote public health? How do we manage things like mental health? I noticed one of the early intro things was the mayor is going to talk about mental health this week. You know, this is obviously something on everybody's minds. So thinking about how do we support and encourage people to be able to help manage their own mental health will be important. And I think this gives us a lot of interest doing so with activity, sitting, and screen time being important. One other thing that's really useful, there were lots of people in that group of used to be active and not active anymore. We know it's super hard to convince people to start exercising or to change behavior in any kind. Now we've sort of dampened down the number of people who do exercise. So how do we go about bringing those people back? Will they naturally start exercising again? Probably not. So what are the different things that we could do to try to reach people in a return to pre-pandemic life? And then do those changes in our sitting and our screen time stick around? Remember how everyone's screen time increased by on average 30%? This is what I get for trying to do two things at once, talking and moving people. Okay, got it. So are those gonna still be here? In particular, in 6 months or in a year, when we've moved through this sort of pandemic period, we'll be using screens as much now as we were at the start of the pandemic. What about sitting? Are those behaviors that sort of stick around, or can we change those back? I have dour predictions about this, and so we'll see if we can come up with strategies to help support those changes. Anyway, thank you guys all for listening. That's sort of an overview of the stuff that we do. I'm happy to appreciate your time.
So if anyone has a question for Jacob, raise your hand. And if you would repeat the question for those online, that would be great.
Super, will do. Yep.
I have a couple of unrelated comments. One, any of you who have thought about or are members of Indirect Fitness Club, they are open. They're open and they've taken the restrictions down on the machine. So they're about fully operative here. At the Indirect Fitness Center, they have 3 or 4 in town. Anyway, your department has done very well with, I think, with the program for Parkinson's disease. I don't think you're personally a part of it, you may be, but I don't think so. Are there other mental health programs, mental health problems that you're dealing with? For example, the big ones are probably depression, schizophrenia. Do you have exercise programs designated for any of those areas?
Excellent question, and thank you. So the question was about, well, first, an important point of order is that Ames Racquet and Fitness is now open. And so for those of you who are online, if you can, going back there would be wonderful. The question was about whether or not there are programs in the kinesiology department for people who have serious mental illness anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, et cetera. And there aren't currently, but I think that's a wonderful idea and a good way to go moving forward. There's been work with the student counseling services to try to figure out if there are ways for them to refer students to us for possible ways that we could engage with them to help change their behavior, start an exercise program that might use a behavioral rather than psychological route for treatment. But we don't have anything quite like Dr. Stegemoller's Parkinson's. I only came in 2017. And I'm still young and excited, so I like the future of that idea.
The impact of socioeconomics on the depression data in the recent days, for example, articles about waiters and waitresses and the elimination of the unemployment supplemental benefits. What, maybe your data doesn't give you the ability to analyze the impact of that. I would think there would be more stress on people in some of those.
Yeah, great question. So the question was about changes in employment status, and in particular for people who have who are in a lower socioeconomic status and how their employment is so tied to their sort of functioning. Now I'm kicking myself for doing this. I took out a couple of slides that are focused on changes in work behaviors. I gave a similar talk to Cirrus, a group that does industry stuff, and it was focused on the workplace changes. So one of the things that compared to those people who continued working in person, those people who are working from home had roughly the same mental health. So flipping people to working from home environments or keeping them in person didn't change a whole lot. But for those people who lost their job, we saw much worse depression, anxiety, et cetera. And the question that you ask is, what about those people who, you know, are still employed but in lower paid jobs? I think that's a fascinating question. So we didn't get hourly like rates, you know, for how much are you getting paid in your current employment, which I think would have been a really good way to go to try to figure out if you're in a low paying job that potentially has higher risk, what does that do for your mental health? In particular, in those, many of those positions were requiring people to keep coming back because maybe it's a meatpacking plant or something else where there were then added risks for a number of reasons. Great question. I can share more with you later. You caught my eye first. Okay.
Really, two questions. One, you talk about screen time and sitting time. Well, how do you balance if some people are sitting while they're watching the screen? So that's kind of a minor question. So how do you differentiate that? Yeah,
they're definitely not mutually exclusive. We can do both. We can do lots of other bad behaviors at the same time too. Not bad behaviors, but other negative, maybe bad behaviors is the way to go. So we can eat while we're watching our and while we're sitting. And so there's lots of these behaviors that can co-occur and are problematic. So the way that we asked in this particular study was asking people to report the number of hours that they engaged in these different types of behaviors, so sitting or screen time. And we didn't say that they had to be distinct from each other.
But the bigger question, I live across the street at Green Hills, and obviously, if you lived in a senior facility, you were really not locked down, but you couldn't move as much. Have you that group of people in terms of their mental health?
Yeah, so what's great questions. The question was about, sorry, I should have been repeating these questions, was about in senior living facilities, how have the mitigation strategies that changed our movement patterns affected people's mental health? And it turns out that the older adult group has been the most resilient of any of the groups in terms of their mental health. Now, in part, this might be the people that we're asking, recruiting Iowa State alums who have obviously at least an Iowa State education and other things. So we're sort of working off of kind of a unique sample in a way. And then you also have to have people who are above the age of 65 or 75 who are filling out online surveys effectively, which also subsets things a little bit. But it overall, I could go back to the slides, but the older adult group had the best mental health on average across. So I think that in particular, the early on effects in long-term care facilities were dramatic. I think the ability to sort of withstand a lot of the stresses of life that build up over time really helped serve older adults pretty well.
How did you quantify depression and anxiety?
How did we quantify depression and anxiety? Great question. So there's a couple of standard measures. The Beck Depression scale on the Beck anxiety inventory that have people self-report the severity of a couple of different symptoms that are the classic symptoms of depression and anxiety. And then we use their self-reports of the different symptoms, put them together to come up with an overall rating. And that can help us put people into different groupings based upon the severity of the symptoms in the last 2 weeks.
Does it matter if you stand at your desk versus sit at your desk?
So is what I would say. It does matter, says the guy who's standing up here. I'm really excited to share that point with everyone. So yes, it does matter. There's a number of studies that show that the sitting time piece is most problematic when people are sitting for extended periods of time without breaking it up. And so sitting at your desk is one of those periods of time where you're not going to get up for 3 hours, 4 hours, maybe, you know, or maybe watching a movie, I guess, is the other alternative. But in most cases, people get up and move around. You know, students in classes come in for 70 minutes, 90 minutes. But at work, if you're sitting, you're going to be there for a long period of time. And that's the type of sitting that's most clearly associated with cardiometabolic health, with mental health, with other things. So if you can figure out ways to break up workplace sitting by either having a standing desk that you use some of the time, a little of the time, any of the time, that's really helpful. Or to figure out ways to engage in meetings that more movement based. Either you stand during meetings or you at least have to go to the conference room, wherever that conference room is. Or maybe you could go for a walk in the meeting. You know, on a different day, we could have all walked while I talked to you guys about this, but not today.
The data you collected is all sort of self-reported. Would the outcomes of this be different if you were interviewing people? This is more of a research question than maybe.
Yeah, great question. So is the self-reported data maybe different in a way than if we'd interviewed people for the data? And I think it's different in a number of ways. So one, people are really bad at telling you how active they are, or how much they sit, or how much screen time they participate in. So for everyone who's in here, think yesterday and think, how many hours of yesterday did I sit? No, really think about it. Like think through the whole day yesterday. Who knows the number? A lot. That's the best number that we have. What do you got?
Did you make a distinction in sitting time and screen time between work-related versus recreational, i.e. watching TV or versus working at your computer?
Yes, no, we did not make a distinction between the type of engaged activity during the screen time or the sitting time. That's a really important point, though. We know that the type of screen time in particular is associated with mental health. So are you doing work-related screen time, or are you doing leisure-related screen time? And is the leisure-related screen time active screen time, or is it passive screen time? So active screen time would be where you're engaging with something, you're actively doing things. Passive screen time is like watching television or Netflix or a show or something like that. Yeah. So anyway, make sure that I'm answering. It is super hard to get people to be able to figure out how much they sat or how much they watched or used a screen, because it's so pervasive. And it's not often the thing that we're doing. So you guys aren't going to go back to whatever you're doing next and say, oh, I went and I was sitting down for an hour. You're going to say, oh, I was at Rotary Club, because the thing that you're doing was Rotary, is not sitting. And so we forget about the way that we're engaging in almost all of our activities. And that makes that information. So I think the numbers would be slightly different, but we'd still see the same relationships. So the same people who had high amounts would still have the worst depression and anxiety from the past research we've seen. Super good question. So there's been some recent data trying to figure out the difference of physical activity that's done at work or physical activity that's done in your leisure time. Do you get from both of those types of physical activity, or are we seeing differences in the way that those affect us? And so for a long time, the occupational physical activity doesn't seem to offer the same benefits as leisure time physical activity for heart health, basically for cardiovascular and metabolic health. The mental health effects are not as well studied. So it looks like activity isn't giving you the same benefits in large part, it's hard to dissociate the types of jobs that engage occupational physical activity with the, and saying, so what are the general mental and physical health effects of being employed in forestry, for instance, a very active job versus an accountant, sure. So if we can take apart those two pieces of this is the employment, and then this is the information about whether or not they're outside or inside, active or inactive, it's hard to tease all of those different pieces apart. So I think the current answer is that it looks like occupational physical activity isn't as beneficial as leisure time physical activity. Maybe a better way to say it is that exercising in your free time is worth even more. If we have to put the right spin on things, I will do so. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Keep exercising.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Meyer, for that good reminder to exercise. Yep, and if you would stick around, somebody will have a question, but also we are a lead sponsor of Raising Readers. We have a book that would be given to a 2-year-old at their well child checkup. And the book this week is Whose Tale Is This? We'd like to give this in your honor for coming to talk, and we'd have you sign the back of this book. So thank you very much. We're going to go from exercising and mental health to next week for Paul Tauke. Use the forester example. Paul Tauke, the City of Ames forester, will be with us for our program next week. And for now, let's all stand and recite our 4-way test. In all that we think, say, or do, is it true? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be better to all concerned? Thank you.
Have a great week. You're like, down to your property.